Hello everybody, and welcome to the Drydock episode 319. This week the questions are taken from guide 393 on the G14 and G15 carrier programs of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and from the Wednesday video on cruiser and destroyer actions of World War II. So, let's commence with the questioning. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, how does the G14 carrier actually stack up in comparison to the Malta and Midway classes, both in initial performance and in theoretical capacity for modernisation? Given how in previous dry docks you've mentioned how the Malta could, and Midway did, manage to serve for quite some time after World War II, if the Japanese for some reason had been allowed to keep such vessels post-war, could they live long enough to see the Hyuga class? In very broad terms, just because of sheer size, the G14 roughly, at least for the information we have for it, would stack up with the Maltas and Midways, albeit that the projected air group for both Malta and Midway is somewhat higher. The flip side to that is that, as I've said before on the channel, once you start to push around 100 aircraft with World War II era carriers, you're pretty much hitting the limit of what you can actually deploy. So the theoretically greater carrying capacity of Malta and Midway doesn't mean too much in terms of overall strike capacity, although it might mean a little bit more resilience in terms of being able to get rid of damaged aircraft and bring new ones in, assuming the pilots are all okay. Obviously, anti-aircraft battery-wise, the British and American carriers would have better anti-aircraft capability, but that's because they have better fire control and anti-aircraft guns to start with, not because there's anything particularly wrong with the G14 as a ship. Just Japanese anti-air just isn't particularly brilliant. Now, based on the ship being an expanded Taiho type design, that means enclosed hangar and armoured flight deck, that would make it a little bit harder to modernise than a Malta or a Midway, but it could be done as long as you get it right first time and you don't end up pulling off a Victorious, albeit that the hangar is plated in rather than armoured in, so it wouldn't be quite as difficult as modernising an Illustrious. In terms of being able to see the Hyuga class, I mean, anything's possible, but realistically, even if the Japanese were allowed to keep such a vessel, let's say, I don't know, it was still on the stocks at the end of World War II, but almost complete, and everyone was being extra paranoid about the Soviet Union or something like that. The biggest issues, apart from the whole, Japanese constitution as per the end of World War II, but again, let's say that's all been revised, is going to be the cost of modernising and upgrading her, because she'd be a single ship, so, therefore associated costs are going to be slightly higher on a per unit basis compared to having multiple ships of the same class. And of course, Japan's economy is somewhat smaller than either the US or the UK's for pretty much the entirety of the Cold War. So what exactly would they do? They would have to give her an angled flight deck to keep her modern, but would they just do a single armored angled flight deck upgrade and then call it a day? Or would they do a Midway style update? And the thing is, even Midway leaves service in the early 90s, and she's the longest lived of the Midway class. Hyuga only comes into service in the mid-2000s, so even if the Japanese did keep her around and kept her updated and maybe kept her as the centerpiece of their fleet, I don't think she's going to see the Hyuga class come into service unless it's as a museum ship. So potentially, if we were being very generous, she might have a similar career to Midway, being updated a couple of times in major overhauls and kept around as the centerpiece of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. But with the end of the Cold War, she would probably be fairly rapidly decommissioned. And if she was a museum ship thereafter, then as a museum ship, she might see the Hyuga class come into service, but keeping her in active service until the mid-2000s, I really don't think is going to happen. Redosaurus asks, why weren't medium cruisers ever a thing? Essentially just because of the way that designations spun out. Before World War I, you had scout cruisers, unprotected cruisers, protected cruisers, and armoured cruisers, and then the first three of those were kind of conglomerating into the light armoured cruiser, so-called because it had a belt, but it was a lot thinner than the armoured cruisers. The armoured cruisers became obsolete with the advent of the battle cruiser, and then it was accepted that you needed at least a degree of belt armour to be a serious cruiser, at which point being a light armoured cruiser was a bit redundant when it was the only kind of cruiser really left standing, at which point you just had a cruiser. Then potentially the scout cruiser looked like it was making a comeback. Then the Washington Naval Treaty came along, you just had cruisers. And then the London Naval Treaties came along, and eventually you obviously ended up with people dubbing things heavy and light cruisers, because obviously antonyms. And then cruisers just kind of, well, were sort of a thing post-war, but it went back into just being cruiser again. So there wasn't ever a time when people were going, oh, well, yeah, this is a light cruiser, this is a heavy cruiser, and this is something in between, so we're going to call it a medium cruiser. There are theoretically some ways you could, with hindsight, say these ships are medium cruisers, but it definitely would not be a thing at the time, because a heavy cruiser ended up being defined treaty limits-wise as having up to 8-inch guns, and a light cruiser was up to 6-inch guns, or 6.1 inch if you want to be technical. But if you wanted to look at ships that were in between a 6-inch cruiser and an 8-inch cruiser, you could make a case for perhaps the Kirovs, which, you know, their gun caliber is almost directly down the middle. They're neither fish nor fowl there. You could also make an argument for something like the York class being a medium cruiser, because they have heavy cruiser guns, but not anywhere near the level of firepower or displacement of a full heavy cruiser, but still having 8-inch guns, they are something of a long-range threat to lighter cruisers. Or you could widen that somewhat more, but you'd have to end up redefining pretty much almost all cruiser designations, bar the heavy cruisers, for the interwar period, and you could make an argument that light cruisers would be under 10,000 ton 6-inch armed cruisers. So things like, well, most of French light cruiser production, most of Italian light cruiser production, the Omahas, the Leanders, the Arethusas, etc. So you could say, right, these are the light cruisers, Atlantas and Didos, or Didos as well. You know, something that's under the treaty weight limits by a considerable margin and has up to 6.1-inch guns. And the heavy cruisers are the full-size 10,000 tonners with 8-inch guns, and then the medium cruiser would then become everything in between. So that would be ships with greater than 6-inch guns, but not full 10,000 tonners. So the, you know, something like a Kirov, which doesn't have 8-inch guns, or the Yorks, which aren't 10,000 tons, would fall into that category. And then the 10,000 ton 6-inch cruisers would also then fall into that category as more powerful than the sub 10,000 tonner 6-inch or smaller armed cruisers, which is a fair assessment. You know, a Dido isn't going to win a fight against a town, a Atlanta's probably not going to win a fight against a Cleveland, and so forth. But equally, they're in turn vulnerable to the bigger, hopefully more heavily protected and significantly more heavily armed ships. So, for example, the Cleveland versus USS Wichita, for instance. In theory, Wichita should win. A county class should beat a town class, etc., etc. But in either case, you're creating a definition where one wasn't before. And although, technically speaking, in terms of blocking out large numbers of ships into each individual designation, the second version actually probably makes more sense. You're far more likely to get a bit of traction on the first version, where just those slightly odd ships between 10,000 ton 6-inch and 10,000 ton 8-inch ships happen to sit. Nikujaga Oishi asks, if flat deck carriers had never been a thing, what would seaplane fleet carriers look like? And how much can you actually do with them beyond reconnaissance, especially with no 10,000 ton restriction from the treaties as per real life? Well, it depends what time period. In the 20s, aircraft aren't really up to all that much, let alone seaplanes and float planes. By the end of the 1930s, however, well, there were float plane versions of the Zero, amongst other things, so you certainly can get a somewhat higher performance seaplane or float plane at that stage, at which point I think, are probably going to see seaplane carriers go down one of two potential routes. Either they just act as somewhat worse aircraft carriers, where different aircraft, fighter, strike, reconnaissance, just all have floats on them, so they can't go quite as far or maneuver quite as well or carry quite as heavy a load, but are still somewhat useful. Or, bearing in mind, you do sometimes see pictures of seaplane carriers, particularly US ones, with things like Catalinas stuck on their backs. You could also potentially see seaplane carriers, especially the larger ones, acting as either literal carriers of, or perhaps as they were historically more usually, mobile bases for larger multi-engine seaplanes. Now, obviously, that has certain limitations because a small seaplane carrier, i.e. one that carries small seaplanes and float planes, can theoretically keep them on deck during most kinds of weather, whereas if you are just towing or accompanying bigger aircraft that are just coming down occasionally, you can't really do that in really rough weather. And even a 20,000-30,000 ton seaplane carrier can only carry a limited number of large aircraft on its decks, and they would be vulnerable to heavy weather. But of course, the much bigger aircraft have much longer range and a much heavier theoretical payload. One potential you could see coming out of it would be smaller seaplanes, as in, instead of a fighter with floats, which is obviously has drag constraints and weight constraints because you're having to haul them around all the time, you might see something that looks like an unholy cross between a Walrus BV-138 and the Saunders Roe float plane fighter, albeit that last one's a jet. Some kind of fighter, maybe even strike aircraft with an internal bomb bay or bombs strapped right up under the wings, where it's actually a true seaplane, i.e. its hull is an actual boat hull as well. But obviously with props, you either are going to have something really weird in terms of look and layout, or you're going to have to mount either a tracked or more likely a pusher propeller up top above the hull, hence why I mentioned the BV-138, and those might be a little bit more efficient than here's a traditional aircraft with the engine in the front on the nose and we've strapped a pair of heavy floats to it, but that's more a question for the aeronautical experts out there. The other advantage of that type is that you could, in theory, have them with folding wings. So although in this scenario we're ruling out flat deck carriers, if, let's say, your theoretical seaplane fighter and strike aircraft can fold their wings straight up vertically, then you might have something that looks a little bit like an open-topped LPD, perhaps with a rolling shutter over the top, where all your aircraft are stored essentially only taking up their hull width plus change, and then they'll be craned out onto the sea to take off. And of course, the extra fun thing of that is that if you are building a really large seaplane carrier of that nature, you could potentially have some mobile cranes, or at least semi-mobile cranes, running down either side of the hull to pick up these aircraft and lower them over the side, or perhaps multiple fixed posts or something like that. So you could actually deploy, say, a dozen aircraft at a time, which of course can then all motor off and take off in different directions of their own free will. Polaris asks, given that we know the Je ne Cole was not a solution to fighting an asymmetric naval war, what would Grand Admiral Drach's doctrine be for fighting a naval war with one of the top naval powers as a nation with a smaller fleet? Maybe, say, a quarter to half the size of the opposing fleet. Right, so you see there's two separate issues. If you are a much smaller navy, then pretty much you're going to be fighting a defensive-only war, and the Swedish model is probably the best one to follow. However, If you are trying to fight a big navy, and your navy is, as said, a quarter to half the size of the enemy fleet, you have to take into account a few considerations. The single biggest one is, why is the enemy fleet so much larger than yours? And what I mean by that is it that big because you have roughly equal industries, but you don't really care too much about your navy? The other side has spent absurdly large amounts of money on it. Or is the enemy navy that large because you're spending proportionally about the same amount of money on your navies, but they just have a much, much bigger industry? Because if it's the former, then you're not in too much problem. If it's the latter, i.e., Japan versus the United States, then you have a much bigger problem. The next stage, so if we assume we're sort of eliminating things where it's not a problem. So, okay, now we're at a stage where the reason our fleet is considerably smaller is because the other guy has much more industrial capacity. Okay, can they be convinced to cede the conflict if they suffer a certain amount of reverses? If no, then you've still got problems. If yes, however, then you have to work out how much pressure can you put on them to get them to come to terms with you, or even possibly defeat them. And in that respect, I think you'd have to configure your navy around two primary goals. Firstly, you would need some way of delivering a huge amount of firepower at very short notice to your enemy's infrastructure, because it doesn't matter how much money your enemy has if they don't have the slipways and dry docks and graving docks and so forth to actually build and maintain a navy. That is going to take a long time to replace if you do it properly, and that gives you the most amount of time to take advantage of everything else that you've got. So depending on the time period, you're either looking at submarines or small, fast, low-lying but heavily armed attack craft, or potentially later aircraft. But in the time period the channel covers, you're still going to have guidance problems with said aircraft. And you've got to remember, the thing is, with stuff like dry docks, although blowing up the caissons or the gates might well work, so torpedo bomber would be good for that, perhaps even more destructive would be blowing up the pumping equipment. And a dive bomber is what you want for that, although accuracy with hitting either of those things would be quite interesting. So if you're really, really going for broke, and we're in a semi-ideal world, I think at that point what you almost want is some variant on a cruiser submarine where you have obviously a very large sail, and the forward part would have rapid firing 5.5 or 6 inch guns, something along those lines, and the aft section would have a semi-dry hangar which can hold a bunch of boats, either fixed or inflatables. And what you'd be aiming to do with this force is, with a few small recon subs, perhaps, recon all the enemy docks. So anywhere there's a dry dock, anywhere there's a major slipway, anywhere there's significant infrastructure. And you'd have to do a kind of almost the submarine equivalent of a time-on-target barrage. Now, it helps if your enemy's coastline is ideally restricted to a single time zone, but if not, then whichever the biggest time zone is. So if you're the Japanese, that'd be US West Coast time, for instance. If you're the Germans going against the British, or the French going against the British, that's obviously GMT. And what you would want to do is get your submarine to sneak in. Obviously, you'd be looking at surprise attack. Sneak in, submarine or two in each of the major bases, or close to each of the major naval bases, as close as you can get. And then at, say, 2 in the morning, when everybody's half asleep, you surface, you drop off a bunch of raiding parties in their small boats who stealthily make their way to the shore. And what they're aiming to do is, because they're landing very, very close to their targets, is just to get to things like the pump house stations and other vital control elements and plant timed detonation charges, probably with a 15 to 20 minute timer. They just have to get them in there and get out. And of course, they may be discovered, it may start firefights, but that's their objective. And as soon as they have started their mission, as soon as they sort of started placing those charges, then ideally you want to wait until your raiding parties get back, at which point the submarine launches a fusillade of gunfire at various important targets, fuel storage tanks, ships moored up, caissons and dry dock gates. Don't really try and take out slipways, they're just big and massive, but dry dock cranes, that kind of infrastructure. Obviously use your torpedoes as well if you can, and after your initial surprise attack is done, then dive and get the heck away. At some point the deck charges will go off, hopefully people will think there's still people ashore, and obviously if it's high risk, because if one of your subs is detected, then you have to abort the entire thing and just pretend it was there to do some recon or something. So you are counting on a lot of things going right, but it could theoretically happen. And for your fleet at sea, for anything that is cruiser size and upwards, you absolutely are designing these things to fight multiple opponents at once and going for the quality over quantity thing. Now, you don't necessarily want to push things quite as far as something like Yamato, which will start an escalation, but if you're planning to start a war, then you could have a Yamato or two or equivalent in your pocket ready for the opening stages of the war. But what I'm talking about would be things like completely symmetrically designed ships. So if you have battleships, then they have 4 triple turrets, 2 forward, 2 aft. Cruisers would be the same. Destroyers you can play a bit more fast and loose with, but probably a high torpedo yield is good. And the idea is that everything would be even more duplicated than on a normal warship. So your foremast and mainmast have identical fire control systems. They each have identical backup systems. They can all interlink with each other, and so on and so forth. And the idea being that, yeah, you have 6 guns, but obviously you're going for the heaviest guns you can. And so if you happen to be lucky enough to engage the enemy one-on-one, then fantastic. You have infinite numbers of fire control systems to give you really accurate readings. But if you are outnumbered, then your ships are designed and your crews are trained to basically go, right, back half of the ship is targeting that, front half of the ship is targeting that, work independently, have fun. Once one of you's killed your target, we'll switch to something else. And likewise with aircraft carriers, you'd want the biggest aircraft carriers you can. If at all possible, try and work out how to get a nice compact folding twin-engined strike aircraft, ideally something that can double as both bomber and torpedo bomber, if not even potentially even a heavy fighter. And that's mainly on the basis of you can't match the enemy in aircraft numbers anyway, so you choose not to fight them on that level. You come up with something longer range and aim to try and just hit the enemy with a slightly smaller but surprising elite strike force from a long distance away where they can't retaliate. Josh Thomas Moore asks, in Drydock 303 you said you'd found new information that made you change your stance on Rodney's torpedo attack from maybe to almost certain. Are you planning to do an addendum video for this information, and are there any other ships or battles you think where an addendum video might be good? I think a whole video dedicated to a single addendum might be pushing it a little. I mean, okay, fair enough, I did do an entire video on why I said Rodney could make 25 knots at a push. So yeah, sometimes it is worth it. But that, to be fair, was me explaining in more detail something that I had already researched quite extensively, and then explaining, the circumstances as to why this was in fact possible and what the evidence said. Conversely, I've already answered why, as you mentioned in Drydock 303, I think Rodney's torpedo hit on Bismarck is pretty much almost a certainty. And that answer took around about 5 minutes, so that's not really enough to make a video. I could, in theory, make a video where I was like, okay, well, here's where Rodney's torpedo rooms were, etc., include some of the survivors' accounts that I mentioned in 303. The survivors' accounts definitely would be worth it, but introducing the fact that Rodney had torpedoes is really just trying to extend the runtime. However, I think perhaps, maybe this year, I don't know, maybe for the end of each year, possibly starting this year, depending on if people can poke me with enough ideas, I might do like an end of the year addendum to various videos video where, that'll be sort of half an hour, 45 minutes of me going, right, well, in this video I said this, and either I now think this, or, or people maybe took it the wrong way because I didn't explain it fully, properly, or clearly enough, or maybe new evidence has come to light and now there is this instead. Kind of, an addendum and notes type thing. I can certainly do that starting next year. Whether or not I've got time to do it this year, considering we're already in October, and of course, anything that I did this year would, in theory, be covering a bunch of points throughout the however many years the channel's been going at this point. That's a little bit more dicey. But if people can think of things that might need an addendum in terms of why do you think this? Has your view on this changed in light of new evidence? Or can you explain this a bit further? Well, if you leave enough of them in the comments, that might be enough for me to generate a video of that type. Vicky asks, if Rodney had aggressively pursued de Grasse's defeated force after the Battle of the Saints, how likely is it that he'd have been able to bag the entire deployed portion of the French battle line, as his critics afterwards alleged he'd passed up the opportunity to do? And B, if he did manage to bag said fleet, what effects would that have had going forward? Well, given that the French fleet had scattered to the four winds almost, it's fairly unlikely that Rodney would have been able to get every single French ship of the line that was making a run for it. In addition to which, of course, various French ships were in different conditions. Some were more damaged, some were less damaged. Some had morale on the verge of breaking, others would fight to the death. So capturing the whole fleet is pretty much out of the question. Even finding all of them is pretty much out of the question. The other thing you've got to remember is that, of course, there are quite a few damaged British ships, both from this battle and also from a previous initial engagement a few days before. So the number of available British ships that can actually pursue is also limited. And of course, every time they come across a French ship that wants to fight for a little bit before it surrenders, then obviously that British ship is going to accrue some damage. Now, some of the damaged ships can still make a pursuit and overhaul some of the more damaged French ships, or will be able to overhaul them once the leading elements have damaged them. So would it be possible to capture a significant number of additional French vessels? Yes. Would it be all of them? No. Would it be a good portion of them? Yeah, probably. Now, if he had managed to take the majority of de Grasse's fleet, or by some hand-wavy circumstance, potentially all of them, but let's focus on most, because realistically the effects are about the same, it obviously gives the British a slightly stronger hand when it comes to negotiations with regards to the wrapping up what was at its core the American War of Independence. Is it going to change America getting its independence? No, that has kind of been decided separately. However, there are a few things which it might change. So you might get an earlier peace, because with essentially no real force left in the West Indies, the French are going to be in a much weaker position. They've taken bigger losses. Their morale is going to be lower. They're going to be pressuring Spain to give over on Gibraltar sooner rather than later. But where it might have even more effect on the Americans, as opposed to the historical battle, which forced the Americans to give up quite a few war aims, at the time that war is finished and peace is declared, the US still has British troops present on the soil of some of what would become the first 13 US states. If the Americans are basically not going to get any help or support whatsoever from the French, because the French no longer have a fleet to speak of in the western part of the Atlantic, there is a potential, now not a particularly large one, but there is a potential for the British to perhaps insist on holding one or two areas where they already have troops, and now the Americans aren't in a shape to take them back. Now, that might prolong negotiations, or you might end up with a situation a bit like Calais was in France for a good long while after various English kings managed to lose most of what was previously British holdings in France, where you might end up not only with obviously Canada still being in British hands, but you might end up with perhaps in the southern part of the US a loyalist enclave centered around one or two port cities, which might then stick like a thorn in the side of everybody for a while, perhaps until the War of 1812, or potentially even longer thereafter, who knows. But that's just one possibility. The possibility, to flip it on its head, where things might go a little bit more wrong for the British, is that they've got this big haul of prizes, but of course it is going to mean more damage to their ships, as we mentioned, and there is a small but reasonably powerful Spanish squadron in the vicinity. Now, if the British have had to crowd their entire fleet and a good portion of the French fleet into harbour to make extensive repairs, given that historically those repairs took a couple of months, in this case, if it's going to maybe be more like 3 months and patching up all these captured ships as well, the Spanish might feel a little emboldened to sail around and maybe try something when there's not really much else at sea in the West Indies, which might give them a tiny bit of leverage when it comes to the negotiating table. But those two extremes aside, the main thing is just going to be essentially getting a few more concessions out of the US. Essentially, the US gets its independence, and that's pretty much it. The British, of course, now will have a bunch more prizes they can integrate into their fleet. The French have even fewer ships. Perhaps that accelerates the French Revolution a little bit more than even historically that whole war did. But overall, Britain comes out of it a little bit stronger, France comes out of it a little bit weaker, the Spanish come out of it a little bit confused, and the Americans come out of it somewhat annoyed. Archie2C asks, the Japanese Navy had plans to swap the turrets of the Mogami and other ships in the event of war. Could the Americans have had, say, better torpedo blisters ready for ships like Wasp, Ranger or Saratoga? I know Lexington had had 8-inch guns removed prior to Coral Sea in preparation for the installation of 5-inch 38s. I mean, in theory, anything's possible, almost anything. In practice, it's not really something that the Americans could have done, because it's not just as simple as going, hey, we've got some pre-formed torpedo blisters, we're going to slap these on the side of our carriers. There's a huge amount of work that has to go into it. I mean, for one thing, you've got various pumps and intakes and so forth down the side of the ship externally. You'd have to work out how to connect all those through, because you're not going to be able to avoid them all. You'd also have to work out how is this going to affect the ship's rolling, because in later periods, over-bulging on Midway made it roll considerably more than was otherwise considered healthy. But you've also got to take into account, of course, you're adding mass to the ship, so it's going to displace more, so in theory it would sink further down, but also, of course, the bulges are hopefully holding air, so that's going to make the ship float higher. And so where in that equation is the ship going to sit? Is it actually going to still sit on the waterline properly? How's it going to affect the underwater hull profile? So are you going to lose speed, gain speed, not have much of a change in speed, etc.? So you'd have to do an absolutely vast amount of work to make sure you're not going to adversely affect the performance of your carriers. Then you'd have to pre-manufacture them all and find somewhere to store them all, which is going to be interesting, because obviously you don't know how long you're going to need to store these things for, and every time the ship comes in for a refit, maybe not so much in the case of Wasp, but especially Ranger and definitely Saratoga, every time the ship comes in for any kind of significant refit, are you going to have to redo all the stuff you've got in storage for them? And then, assuming that you go through all of that, then once war is declared, well, that is exactly when you need your carriers, whereas dragging the things into dry dock, particularly dragging the things either into a dry dock where your storage facilities for your pre-made blisters are, or organising shipping for them to a dry dock closer to where the ship actually is or is needed, then you've got to obviously take it out of service, defuel it, de-store it, etc., get it into the dry dock, stick all these things on, test, paint, spray, put it back in the water, test, load it up, take it back out again. You'd potentially be taking ships out of service just at the time when you absolutely need them. And then what have you got in exchange? Assuming you've got all your calculations correct, you've got a ship that's somewhat better protected against torpedoes. Great, fantastic. Try not to get torpedoed in the first place. I know that sounds a little bit cynical, but Saratoga did take a few torpedo hits and stood up to it. Ranger, of course, didn't get hit at all. Wasp is probably the one case where that might have actually helped, but it's a kind of a cost versus opportunity. It's going to cost a huge amount of money to develop. It's going to cost a huge amount of money to make and store. It's going to cost a huge opportunity in actually installing them against an event that may or may not actually occur. And, what might the Japanese do whilst your ship or ships are in fact out of service? Whereas, of course, the Japanese, who knew the war was coming because they were planning to launch the war, could get their refits done earlier, before everything goes pear-shaped. Will Pat asks, I've been interested in the Mark II 16-inch 50 cal guns that were fitted to the or supposed to be fitted to the Iowas before the famous miscommunication issues that forced them to design the Mark VII, a smaller and lighter gun. I've been most interested in the sacrifices that were made to fit the smaller gun. I noticed that when the Mark VI 16-inch 45 cal guns went from using the intended lighter shell to the super heavy shell, the powder was actually increased, and because of this I assume it'd be fair to guess the Mark II 50 cal guns would at least not have their amount of powder decreased when going from the lighter to the super heavy shells. Conservatively, keeping the powder weight the same, the Mark II guns were supposed to use 700 pounds of powder, while the Mark VII guns used 660 pounds with the super heavy shell, which is 40 pounds or about 6% less. So, assuming that 6% more powder gives you 6% more power, the muzzle velocity would then get the super heavy shell to about 2,650 feet per second compared to the Mark VII's 2,500 feet per second, an increase of 150 feet per second. That's nearly the same increase in muzzle velocity that the Mark VII has over the 45 caliber Mark VI guns. Is there any way to get an idea of how much power was actually sacrificed by going to the lighter Mark VIIs? Well, this would require a lot more research to work out in detail. I'd have to find the records of what exactly they were intending, in fact, on doing with the older 16-inch 50 Mark IIs, for example. One of the interesting things is that the chamber volume on the Mark IIs is a little bit larger than that on the Mark VIIs, and at the same time, the rifling on the Mark VIIs is somewhat tighter than the rifling on the Mark IIs, so the older guns have a more gentle rifle, which actually immediately addresses one of the first concerns that popped into my head when I read this, which was, well, what happens when you stack even more powder behind a super heavy shell? Is that going to cause it to over-rotate and you get the over-stabilized problems that the Italians had? But if the rifling on the Mark IIs is gentler, then actually you might not have that issue. But of course, the flip side to that is that more powder takes up more space, and as well as having a larger chamber, that means the Mark II guns have commensurately a shorter rifled section of the gun, and with the super heavy shells being considerably longer than the Mark III shells that the Mark II guns were originally supposed to use. Again, this is something I'd have to look at in a little bit more detail in terms of overall chamber length and so forth, but it's possible that in order for the super heavy shell to actually fit without being rammed too far into the rifled section of the barrel to the point that you're beginning to lose some of the effective barrel length, you might actually end up having to reduce the overall charge. So, it's possible it might have ended up using the same charge as the Iowas did historically anyway. But, as I said, this is something that is actually a genuinely interesting bit of investigation. What would the exact capabilities of the Mark II gun with super heavy shells have been compared to the historical Mark VII? But that's the kind of thing that I think who knows, someone may have done the research already. If they have, let us know in the comments below. And if not, I will put that down on my list of things to investigate next time I'm over in the States at NARA and or have access to the Mark 7s themselves on one of the Iowas. A.B. Coates asks, in your final Johnny Walker video, it's noted that the crew of HMS Starling smoked an average of 35 cigarettes a day during the ship's first year. In the time period the channel covers, how common was smoking aboard warships? Were any restrictions or precautions taken, especially on older wooden ships? And are there any cases of fire damage to ships from smoking accidents? Smoking aboard warships was pretty common from the moment it was introduced into Western Europe. Pipes, obviously, for the majority of the age of sail, and then giving way to cigars and cigarettes as time went on forward. Were there restrictions and precautions taken? Yes. For example, no one was going to be allowed to smoke or even take smoking equipment anywhere close to the ship's magazines, or indeed anywhere that live ammunition was going to be handled, so for example in the turrets. In addition, anywhere that it's necessary to keep quite clean, and or where there might be a fire risk, so for example anywhere connected to fuel handling, especially aviation or boat fuel, and to a certain extent in the ship's machinery spaces, although that could vary with time, especially in places like boiler rooms. As far as fire damage from smoking accidents, yeah, there's a fair bit. Most of it would be relatively minor fires, from a match that was dropped while it was still maybe not quite put out, or a cigarette that was stubbed out in the wrong substance, and so forth. But an awful lot of that tends to be under the general heading of small fires that randomly happen to break out on warships, which a lot of the time people don't look quite so closely for the original cause of, although it's possible that covert smoking did cause one or two of the more spectacular accidents. For example, it being blamed, at least in one theory, for the destruction of the Japanese battleship Mutsu, but as with all sorts of major magazine explosions, the evidence tends to be scattered to the four winds, so good luck working out which one is in particular true. Kra F1 asks, what special tactics, formations, or precautions did fleets take when transiting choke points when potentially facing combat? For example, the 2nd Pacific Squadron sailing past Singapore, and later on the Japanese Navy sailing to and from the Indian Ocean, or the Japanese Centre Force sailing to Samar at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It varies quite considerably with time, and that's to do with two things. Firstly, what kind of propulsion technology are you using, and then latterly, what kind of threat are you potentially facing? So, in the age of sail, for instance, your major hazard as you sail through a choke point is potentially being ambushed by an enemy fleet. So you would solve that problem by using your outriding frigates to scout, and then depending on how seriously you think there is a threat of potential hostile action, you may even transit the choke point in battle formation, so putting your ships into either a line or perhaps a pair of parallel lines that can then fold into one line. But that's really all you have to worry about, because obviously when you're under sail, if you're sailing roughly with the wind, then if somebody's waiting for you on the other side and your frigates don't spot them in time to tell you that they're there, or even if they do spot them, and obviously there's not a huge amount you could do to not meet them, then your opponent will, at least in theory, be sailing against the wind to catch you, because if they're waiting around a headland and intend to use the wind to run you down, well then at that point they're also giving you free run to run headlong with the wind as well, which means they might not catch you. A somewhat similar situation faces you in the middle of the 19th century, except for the fact, of course, now with steam power, you and your opponent can sail independently of the wind. So in an era where perhaps a lot of ships are still sail-powered, you might want to use your steam power, if your fleet is entirely steam auxiliary at least, to transit the strait or the choke point at a point where the wind direction would favour you or at least very much not favour an attacker, again using scouts. And then once everybody is pretty much steam powered as the 19th century progresses, you have to worry just about, is there an enemy fleet there? That's why you send in your scouting ships first, and at this point they might be frigates, they might be cruisers, and proceed pretty much as you would in the age of sail. But then as the 19th century continues to roll on and you have the potential of attack by torpedo boats and destroyers, this is when things start to get a lot more interesting, because now rather than just sending through a few small ships to check, hey, is there anybody on the other side? If not, fine, we can proceed. Now, when you might have small ships hiding away in little coves and so forth, or just perhaps not being seen, or potentially able to close in quite quickly, this is when you would maybe go through with a either full battle formation or a close to battle formation, a traveling formation escort ring around your ships, as well as your scouts and outriders and so forth. Now, obviously, in general travel, that will be, at that point, maybe you're talking about coming up to the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, you'd be talking about traveling in several columns, but that's still a formation designed to maximize protection against torpedo assault. Once you get into the 20th century fully, you have to factor in the potential of attack by submarines and then later on aircraft to an even greater extent. So, of course, your escort formation is going to change somewhat again, because even a torpedo attack by torpedo boats or destroyers relies on you being able to see your opponent and your opponent being able to see you, which limits the places they can come from. Whereas, of course, with a torpedo attack, the submarine could be sitting right in front of you and you might not know it until it's too late. So at that point, you would either potentially look at avoiding said choke point if you thought there was a chance of enemy submarines stalking you there, or you would be leading in, instead of just using a scout to visually check things, you'd be talking about multiple scouts, i.e. sloops, corvettes, frigates, destroyer escorts, escort destroyers, whatever, pinging away madly to sanitize the area ahead of you of submarine contacts, plus other similar escorts riding on either side, listening for submarines trying to slip in from either side, potentially zigzagging, potentially transiting at high speed to throw off submarines' aim and so forth, as well as obviously utilizing aerial reconnaissance to look out for submarine periscopes or enemy scouting aircraft. And depending on how confident you are at your night spotting skills and your sonar equipment, you might also try transiting at night, where it's harder for your opponents to see you, because ultimately even a submarine is still reliant somewhat on visual sightings. So if you can pass through at high speed in a darkened state, even if there is a submarine waiting for you, if you've got sonar and good night spotting equipment, and perhaps you think maybe the best thing the submarine has is a slightly dodgy hydrophone, you might still be able to pass through without too much problem, especially if it's a moonless night. PRGM Horse asks, through the magical power of hand-waving, the negotiations for the Washington Naval Treaty are delayed by 3 years. How does this change the treaty, the fleets, and World War II? Now, this is a rather interesting one, because it depends exactly what you mean. If you mean the negotiations start when they do historically, it just takes them another 3 years to come up with a final treaty, then probably not a lot changes, because construction generally was mostly suspended during a good chunk of the Washington negotiations, because everybody obviously had an interest in not spending vast amounts of money on a new naval arms race, so it would just draw that process out by considerably longer, at which point you end up with pretty much historically what you got, except for the fact that the Nelsons will obviously benefit from another 3 years of R&D, because obviously they're going to be built afterwards and completed a little bit later, and therefore will be slightly less worn come World War II. That's really about the only thing. Oh, and of course, much as the Audacious class Ark Royal would historically suffer with a number of issues, because it was essentially left in a half-completed state in a dockyard for several years, the Akagi, Kaga, Lexington, and Saratoga might suffer from similar issues of being left in a sort of semi-complete state for multiple years while negotiations continue. Whereas if the treaty negotiations just don't start for 3 years compared to when they historically started, that's a fun one, because in theory the Japanese will have Tosa and Kaga completed to their battleship specs. The two keys probably will either be completed or near completing, assuming that the Great Kanto earthquake hasn't done in for any of them. Amagi is still going to be totaled by the Great Kanto earthquake. There's not really a huge amount Japan can do about that, but the other 3 Akagis will be in service, so that gives the Japanese 4 battleships and 3 battle cruisers of modern type above 35,000 tons, plus of course Nagato and Mutsu, which are all either in service or almost in service. As far as the British are concerned, they will have, if it's 3-year delay, probably have built the G3s, and the N3s will either be at completion or just coming up to completion, depending on how much pedal to the metal the Royal Navy is forced to do. I mean, given the fact that aside from the Great Kanto earthquake, just the G3 and N3 programs would mean that the Japanese would have pretty much caught up with them in terms of modern capital ships, possibly being slightly ahead if you include the Nagatos in that, at least in terms of hull numbers. And of course the Japanese would be in the middle of building the number 13s. So while the G3s would be in service and the N3s are almost in service, there would almost certainly be another class of at least G3 successors, possibly even N3 successors on the stocks, although the G3 successors would probably be a good way towards completion, perhaps at hull launch stage, whereas the N3 successors would probably be only just started. The US, of course, would have the Lexingtons and the South Dakotas pretty much complete, and will have started on some form of successor, at least to the South Dakotas, I would imagine. They had a lot of issues with the Lexington, so revising a new strategy for the Lexingtons might take a bit longer, so maybe the Lexington successors, whatever they happen to be, would be on the stocks but not launched. I suspect 3 years from historical, so 1924 going into 25, the South Dakota successors might very well actually be complete. And although we don't have a huge idea about what exactly the US was looking at post-South Dakota, because they had several different ideas following the freezing of the South Dakota designs, but they were constantly one-upped by new developments, and none of them reached particularly detailed design stage before the Washington Treaty intervened historically. The last thing for which we have any remote degree of vague confidence on is essentially a longer version of a South Dakota massing 45 to 50,000 tons. And this would have seen the introduction of the parallel hull form, at least amidships, which you see on the US fast battleships in the 1930s. And although that would still be looking at a 23 knot top speed, so still a relatively slow battle line, there are some indications that that form would have been looking at potentially having twin 18-inch 48 caliber guns instead of 16-inch 50. So a modified South Dakota with twin 18s instead of triple 16s would be, relatively speaking, quick to design and build compared to an entirely clean slate design. So that much as the Tennessees and the Colorados have a similar relationship. Now that poses us a couple of problems. Firstly, the new treaty limit displacement is going to be, depending on exactly how much everybody is displacing, probably either 45 to 50,000 tons for capital ships, because there's going to be far too many capital ships in that range already in service. Whether it's 45 or 50,000, I think it's just going to depend on which exact versions of the later ships various navies go for. And the tonnage levels are going to have to be higher. The gun limit's going to have to be 18 inches because, again, that's what everybody's got at the time. The interesting thing is that actually, in terms of what everybody has either built or almost built, the overall tonnage ratios probably still work out, because the Japanese, if you don't include Nagato and Mutsu, so if we're talking the 40,000 tonner plus category, are going to have 7 modern capital ships, which they can argue to keep with the number 13s building. The Americans are probably going to have 18, bearing in mind that at least the South Dakota successors will probably be in the water, with probably Lexington successors building. The British will probably have a dozen, i.e. the G3s, G3 successors, and the N3s in the water, with N3 successors building. And if you factor in all ships with 16 and 18 inch guns, then obviously the Americans also would have 4 Colorados, and the Japanese would have 2 Nagatos to add to the mix. So overall, the Americans are probably going to be looking at, going from the Colorados forward, 20 to 22 capital ships in service, with more building. The Japanese, if you include the Nagatos, obviously, are going to have 9, with given a number still building. And the British, as we said, are going to have 12, and they don't have any Nelson equivalents. Now, bearing in mind the US government that came in and eventually negotiated the Washington Treaty was being somewhat conservative, they didn't want to be particularly foreign seas adventurous. So if we pull it back to a nice rounder number and say that perhaps the US only ordered 4 South Dakota successors, so they have 20 16-inch and up ships in service. The British are going to want parity or near parity with that, so if we allow in for Hood as well, because as I've said before, the US rated air is roughly equivalent to a Colorado, that means the British would be allowed to complete the N3 successors, so then that would give them 16 modern capital ships plus Hood, at which point you might see them arguing for a Nelson-style allowance of adding in 3 or possibly 4, if they're prepared to sacrifice Hood, more ships to round up to the American level, or they might agree to keep Hood and, say, the QEs, which tonnage-wise might add up to roughly the same, in exchange for, maybe they have to get rid of one of the QEs, but in exchange for perhaps a significant overhaul and modernization of the QEs to bring them up to a little bit more like modern combat spec. The Japanese, in theory, should then have 12, assuming that they agree to a similar 5-5-3 type arrangement, which would give them scope to complete some of the number 13s and perhaps convert one to a carrier. DM Phoenix asks, during the late 1890s and early 1900s, several navies chose to utilise the enclosed tubular foremasts, such as the Kaiser Friedrich III, Trafalgar class, and many French pre-dreadnoughts like the Charles Martel. This type seems to have a number of benefits, such as a roughly aerodynamic shape, an enclosed interior for access, protected 360-degree spotting tops, and a generally clean appearance compared to contemporary tripod and cage masts. By World War I, it seems most new designs had switched to tripod masts or simple pole masts. Why was this style of mast abandoned, and what benefits did the tripod or cage mast have over the tubular mast? And could it also be said that these made a comeback in the American fast battleships from North Carolina onwards, or were these different in overall concept? It's not really the same with the 1930s American fast battleships, because in those, this kind of semi-pyramidal superstructure they have up front, does end up with a mast of some kind above anyway for the final mounting of equipment, but B, it's a superstructure, admittedly a tall superstructure, but there are compartments inside each level and they all have purpose, as opposed to, as you can see here, the tubular mast, where it is mainly a mast with things outside of it. So, you know, slightly different, and kind of the hybrid in between, I guess, would actually be maybe the Japanese pagoda masts, but they're a completely different subject. Now, as for why the circular mast died out, well, there are 2 primary weaknesses that these circular or tubular masts have compared to tripod or cage masts. Firstly, the tubular masts are designed to support not just people going up and down, but also ammunition going up and down, because as you can see just about on this picture of Charles Martel, they have fighting tops as well as spotting tops, and the fighting tops are equipped with guns. The guns, of course, need an ammunition supply, and this is the light anti-torpedo boat armament. By the time of World War I, anti-torpedo boat or anti-destroyer armament is basically the ship's secondary battery, which is either mounted high in the hull encasements or low in the superstructure. It is not mounted any longer on the masts, so without the need to support the weight of guns and their crews and ammunition hoists and so forth, then you don't need the fighting tops, which removes a lot of the incentive to have the tubular masts. The other thing is that the tubular masts are massive, both colloquially and in the literal sense. They weigh an awful lot compared to a tripod mast or a cage mast. And so by World War I, when really all you need to support near the top of your mast is a lookout position and range-finding equipment, Well, you can do that with a tripod mast and to a lesser extent with a cage mast. And yes, you can also do that with a tubular mast, but the tubular mast is going to weigh an awful lot more and take up a lot more footprint further down inside the ship, and therefore it's just more efficient to switch over to the other kind of masts. US Navy Sailor asks, in your final Johnny Walker video, you mentioned some specially designed projectiles for the 4-inch guns that were mounted on most of the anti-submarine warfare vessels. These shells were designed to be able to accurately penetrate the water to give them an ability to hit submarines at periscope depth or just below the surface. Are there any instances in which these projectiles were used as intended, and what were the results? Unfortunately, combat use of the Shark anti-submarine projectiles, which were eventually designed for a variety of smaller caliber weapons, is a murky field. There are reports indicating that they were issued and were used in late 44 and early 45, supposedly with good or satisfactory results, but then trying to track down exactly which ships were actually using them and what they sank as a result is considerably more difficult. This, by the way, incidentally, is a mock-up of a submarine side that's been hit by a number of Shark anti-submarine projectiles with, well, fairly obvious effects, as you can see. One of the big problems was the Shark, as you can probably tell from the picture, was a very big, heavy projectile, even for a 4-inch gun, and required its own special setting because it had completely different ballistic properties to a regular shell. So if your guns were preloaded with regular shells, you'd probably just end up using those rather than have a break in the firing specifically to load the much heavier and harder to load Shark. But nonetheless, as I said, apparently it seems to have been used to some effect. Certainly, in what we do know for more definite is that post-war, when German U-boats were being disposed of, a number of ships that were in charge of disposing of them were actually using Shark projectiles, which seems to indicate that they at least knew that they would work and had them aboard as part of their standard loadout. Now, they were also using things like limbo launchers as test items, but from the context, the way they're describing using Shark projectiles with their guns, they seem to already know that this will be an effective way of dealing with enemy subs. So we do have some definitive records of that, and they did seem to work. But weirdly, unless and until somebody does some more research, exactly what usage they got, if you like, in the field in late 44 and early 45 against the rapidly diminishing number of German U-boats is still a little bit of a murky topic. Unless, of course, somebody has already done that research and just not published it or published it in an obscure place. In which case, hey, maybe we can find out together. If not, I can add it to the long list of other things I have to look up at the National Archives. Brian Stevens asks, Drach, we see big figures talked about like Hitler, Churchill, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Stalin in terms of their impact on their nations in the lead up to World War II. Is there no one in Japan who is similar? I understand there were lots of cabals, etc. Is there any one or more people that stand out in particular? Unless you want to go with Hirohito himself, the emperor, not really. In terms of political power moves, obviously Stalin was dictator in the USSR pretty much the entire time in the run-up to World War II. Hitler, of course, obviously in power from, roughly speaking, 33 onwards. FDR had already had a reasonable run as president before the American involvement in World War II. And Churchill, although he came in during the World War II, he wasn't obviously Prime Minister at the time. At the start, that was Chamberlain. Churchill was a consistent, proactive figure with regards to British preparations for World War II during the 1930s. The problem with the Japanese is because of those massive power struggles internally between the Navy, the Army, and various civilian political entities, the Japanese Prime Minister, which would be the equivalent, changed at least 11 or 12 times in the 1930s, very few of them even lasting more than a year. and none of them lasting much more than 2 years. In fact, the longest serving one before Tojo, who would be the prime minister during the war, was Viscount Saito Makoto, and he lasted just a little bit more than 2 years and 1 month, and that was back in the beginning of the 1930s. After him, the longest anybody lasted was actually repeat Prime Minister Prince Fumimaro Konoe, I think, or Konoe. So he was Prime Minister in the second half of 1937 through to the beginning of 1939, and then he was also temporarily again Prime Minister between mid-1940 and the end of 1941, and in October 1941, that's when he handed over to Tojo. But yeah, everybody else was just slipping in and out of the position. Some were Navy, some were Army. It was a complete mess. So whilst the military as a whole was pushing Japan into conflict, the Army, of course, pushing for conflict in China, and the Navy pushing for conflict anywhere that wasn't China, there wasn't a single unifying political figure who was driving it forward. More just, as you said, the sort of the cabals, the collective will of the Japanese military and the militant culture they built up around themselves. Hirohito obviously was involved as the emperor. He had a certain amount of responsibility there. However, whilst everybody had to respect him, and he did obviously have his own thoughts and support behind the various actions the Japanese took, he was, to a limited degree, still beholden to the whim of the various political parties, the biggest block of which, of course, being his own military. And that is it for this week. Thank you very much for listening. If you're listening at the time of release or shortly thereafter, I will hopefully be aboard a plane heading to Italy for a 1-week visit there. So hopefully I'll see 1 or 2 Italian subscribers over there and bring back some rather interesting content from that country's northern military, well, maritime history at least, museums. So yeah, thanks for listening, and see you again in another video soon. Toodles for now.